Margaret Sullivan stood at the train station platform in Denver, Colorado, clutching a worn leather suitcase and a letter that had changed her life forever. The autumn wind of 1889 whipped through her dark auburn hair as she gazed down the tracks, waiting for the locomotive that would carry her toward an uncertain future in the remote town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. At 26, she had made a decision that would have scandalized the proper ladies of Boston. She had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride traveling 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Thomas Garrett didn't know about his intended bride could destroy both their lives. Hidden beneath Margaret's carefully composed letters and proper penmanship lay a secret that had driven her from everything she had ever known, a truth that made her hands tremble as she held his photograph. The rancher, with 6 orphaned children, believed he was getting a woman who could complete his fractured family. But Margaret knew she could never give him the one thing most men wanted above all else: children of their own. Margaret had been running from her past for 3 years, ever since the devastating news from Dr. Whitmore had shattered her world in a Boston examining room. The words still echoed in her mind with crystalline clarity. "I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan, but the complications from your illness have made it impossible for you to bear children. The damage is permanent and irreversible." She had been engaged then to Charles Pemberton, a promising young lawyer from a respectable family. Their wedding was planned for the spring of 1887, with invitations already printed and her mother's silk dress altered to perfection. But when Margaret found the courage to tell Charles the truth about her condition, his reaction had been swift and merciless. Within a week, he had broken their engagement, citing fundamental incompatibilities to their social circle, while privately telling Margaret that he needed a wife who could give him heirs. The shame had been unbearable. Her mother, Eleanor Sullivan, had taken to her bed for weeks, claiming the disgrace would kill her. Her father, a stern banker named Harrison Sullivan, had barely spoken to Margaret for months, his disappointment radiating through their Beacon Hill mansion like a winter chill. The whispers followed her everywhere, to church, to social gatherings, even to the modest teaching position she had taken at the local school for girls. Boston society had a long memory for scandal, and Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, and suitable men stopped calling. The weight of being seen as damaged goods, as a woman who had failed at her most basic feminine duty, pressed down on her shoulders until she could barely breathe. In the city that had once been her home, it was Mrs. Adelaide Crowley, the elderly widow who ran the boarding house where Margaret had moved after leaving her family home, who first showed her the newspaper advertisement. Mrs. Crowley had been widowed young herself and understood something about the narrow paths available to women who didn't fit society's expectations. "Look here, dear," she had said one evening in November 1888, spreading the Rocky Mountain news across the kitchen table. "This man sounds decent enough. A rancher in Wyoming, lost his wife 2 years ago, raising 6 children on his own. Says he needs a good woman to help him manage his household and care for the little ones." Margaret had read the advertisement with growing interest. Thomas Garrett of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, described himself as 34 years old, the owner of a cattle ranch, and desperately in need of a wife to help raise his deceased brother's children, whom he had taken in after a tragic accident. The advertisement was straightforward and honest, mentioning nothing about wanting more children or expanding his family. He seemed focused entirely on the welfare of the 6 orphans already in his care. For weeks, Margaret had carried the newspaper, clipping in her reticule, reading and rereading Thomas's words. Finally, she had gathered the courage to write her first letter, carefully crafting her response to emphasize her experience with children through her teaching. her practical skills in running a household, and her genuine desire to care for young ones who had lost their parents. She had been truthful about many things: her education, her background, her reasons for leaving Boston, but she had not mentioned her medical condition. How could she explain in a letter that she was barren, that the fever that had nearly killed her 3 years ago had stolen her ability to be a complete woman? Some truths were too heavy for paper and ink. Thomas's response had come quickly, written in a firm, steady hand that spoke of education and careful thought. He had asked practical questions about her cooking abilities, her experience with children of different ages, and her willingness to live in a remote location far from the conveniences of city life. His letters painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by responsibility, but determined to do right by the children in his care. Over the course of 6 months, their correspondence had grown warmer and more personal. Thomas had described the ranch, 1,500 acres of grazing land, nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, with a sturdy log house that his brother had built with his own hands. He had written about each of the children with evident affection. Sarah, the eldest at 14, who had taken on far too much responsibility, helping to raise her younger siblings. The twins, Michael and Matthew, rambunctious 10-year-olds who reminded him daily of his deceased brother. Rebecca, 8 years old, and still plagued by nightmares about the influenza outbreak that had claimed her parents. Little Emma, only 5, who had barely spoken since arriving at the ranch. And baby James, just 18 months old, who toddled around the house, getting into everything and bringing moments of joy to the grieving family. Margaret had found herself genuinely caring about these children she had never met. Her letters had grown longer and more detailed as she shared stories from her teaching experience, offered advice for handling Rebecca's nightmares and Emma's selective muteness, and described the games and activities that might help the twins channel their energy productively. Thomas had begun addressing her as Dear Margaret, rather than Miss Sullivan, and had started sharing more personal details about his own struggles and fears. He had told her about the loneliness of eating meals in silence, about his worry that he wasn't enough for the children who had lost so much, about his fear that he was failing them every day. His vulnerability had touched something deep in Margaret's heart, and she had found herself writing back with equal honesty about her own loneliness, her sense of being adrift in a world that no longer had space for her. The proposal, when it came, had been characteristically straightforward. Thomas had written that he believed they could build a good life together, that he thought she would be a blessing to his household and the children who needed a mother's care. He had offered to send money for her train ticket and had asked her to consider making the journey to Cedar Ridge for a brief courtship period before they made any final commitments. Margaret had accepted immediately, though her heart had pounded, with terror and hope in equal measure. She had used her small savings to purchase appropriate clothing for ranch life, practical dresses in sturdy fabrics, warm coats, and sensible boots. She had resigned from her teaching position, said goodbye to the few friends who still acknowledged her, and had endured a final, painful conversation with her parents. Her mother had wept and pleaded with her not to go to that wilderness, predicting that she would be killed by Indians or wild animals or harsh weather. Her father had been coldly disapproving, telling her that she was throwing away her last chance at respectability by running off to marry a stranger. Neither of them had offered to attend a wedding, and Margaret had realized, with a mixture of sadness and relief, that she truly had nothing left to keep her in Boston. Mrs. Crowley had been the only one to see her off at the train station, pressing a small package of tea and biscuits into her hands and whispering words of encouragement. "You're braver than you know, dear girl," the old woman had said. "That man and those children are lucky to have you, even if they don't realize it yet." The journey west had taken 4 days, with changes in Chicago and Denver. Margaret had spent the time alternately reading and staring out the window at the changing landscape, watching the familiar forests and farmlands of the east give way to the vast prairies and towering mountains of the frontier. Each mile had carried her further from everything she had known and closer to a future that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Now, standing on the platform in Denver with her connection to Cedar Ridge just hours away, Margaret felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She was traveling to marry a man she knew only through letters, to become an instant mother to 6 grieving children, to build a life in a place she had never seen. And she was doing it all while carrying a secret that could destroy any chance of happiness they might have together. The whistle of the approaching train cut through her thoughts, and Margaret straightened her shoulders, picked up her suitcase, and prepared to board the locomotive that would carry her toward whatever fate awaited her in the mountains of Wyoming. In her reticule, carefully folded between Thomas's letters and her train ticket, was the business card of Dr. Whitmore, a reminder of the truth she would someday have to share with the man who believed she could give him everything he needed. As the train pulled into the station, with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes, Margaret whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She prayed for courage, for wisdom, for the strength to be the woman that Thomas and his children needed her to be. Most of all, she prayed that when the truth finally came to light, the love she hoped to build would be strong enough to survive. The conductor called out destinations, and Margaret heard Cedar Ridge among them. She took a deep breath, tasted the thin mountain air, and stepped forward to meet her destiny. The train to Cedar Ridge wound through mountain passes that took Margaret's breath away, even as her stomach churned with nervous anticipation. Fellow passengers were few. A traveling salesman heading to mining towns, an elderly couple visiting their son, and a stern-faced woman in black who spoke to no one. Margaret pressed her face to the window, watching pine forests give way to rolling meadows dotted with cattle, trying to imagine the life that awaited her at journey's end. When the conductor finally called Cedar Ridge, Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. The town was smaller than she had expected, little more than a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple pointing toward snow-capped peaks, and a scattering of houses that seemed dwarfed by the vast landscape surrounding them. She gathered her belongings with trembling hands, stepped onto the platform, and found herself face to face with Thomas Garrett for the first time. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical labor, and hands that were calloused but gentle as he reached for her suitcase. His brown hair was streaked with premature gray, and lines around his blue eyes suggested a man who had seen more sorrow than his 34 years should have carried. But his smile was warm and genuine as he removed his hat and introduced himself. "Miss Sullivan, I presume. I'm Thomas Garrett. Welcome to Cedar Ridge." His voice was deeper than she had expected, with a slight drawl that spoke of southern origins. Margaret found herself studying his face, searching for signs of the character she had come to know through his letters. What she saw reassured her. Intelligence in his eyes, kindness in the way he waited patiently for her to find her voice, strength tempered by gentleness in his manner. "Mr. Garrett," she managed, extending her gloved hand. "Thank you for meeting me. The journey was quite an adventure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Thomas chuckled, a sound that eased some of the tension in Margaret's chest. "I imagine it was. The railroad only reached Cedar Ridge 2 years ago. Before that, visitors had to come by stagecoach or horseback. You picked the easier route." He loaded her trunk onto a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 patient horses, then helped her up onto the seat beside him. As they drove through the town's single main street, Thomas pointed out the essential establishments. Morrison's General Store, Dr. Helen Blackwood's medical practice, the Cedar Ridge Hotel where she would stay until their wedding, and the schoolhouse where her teaching experience might prove valuable. Dr. Blackwood is quite remarkable, Thomas explained, as they passed a neat white building with a painted sign. She came here from Philadelphia 5 years ago. The town was skeptical about a woman doctor, but she's proven herself many times over, delivered half the babies in the county, and patched up more cowboys and miners than anyone can count. Margaret noted the respect in his voice and filed away the information. A woman doctor in a frontier town suggested that Cedar Ridge might be more progressive than she had dared hope. Perhaps there would be opportunities here that hadn't existed in the rigid society of Boston. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes along a rutted dirt road that wound between pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Thomas kept up a steady conversation, pointing out landmarks and neighbors' properties, his easy manner helping Margaret relax despite her growing nervousness about meeting the children. "The kids are excited to meet you," he said as they crested a hill and the ranch buildings came into view. "Sarah's been cleaning the house for 3 days straight, though it was already spotless. The twins have been practicing their manners, which is an adventure in itself. Rebecca made you a drawing, and Emma picked wildflowers, though she won't admit it if you ask her directly." The ranch house was larger than Margaret had expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide front porch and flower boxes that showed a woman's touch. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see faces pressed against the windows. As the wagon pulled up to the front gate, the door burst open and children spilled onto the porch. Thomas had described them accurately, but seeing them in person struck Margaret with unexpected emotion. Sarah, the 14-year-old, stood slightly apart with baby James on her hip, her expression guarded but curious. She had inherited her father's brown hair and serious demeanor, but her eyes held the premature wisdom of a child forced to grow up too quickly. The twins, Michael and Matthew, were impossible to tell apart at first glance, with sandy hair and freckled faces that radiated barely contained energy. They bounced on their toes, whispering to each other and shooting glances at Margaret that mixed excitement with apprehension. Rebecca, at 8, hung back near the door, one finger twisted in her blonde curls. Her blue eyes were large in a thin face, and Margaret could see the lingering effects of trauma in the child's careful stillness. In her hand, she clutched what appeared to be a folded piece of paper. Little Emma, 5 years old with dark hair in uneven braids, sat on the porch, steps with a handful of wilted wildflowers in her lap. She watched Margaret with solemn brown eyes, but said nothing, her silence more eloquent than words. Baby James, unaware of the gravity of the moment, reached chubby arms toward the stranger and babbled happily. His innocent joy broke the tension, and Margaret found herself smiling genuinely for the first time since leaving Denver. "Children," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm, "this is Miss Margaret Sullivan, the lady I've been telling you about. She's come a very long way to meet us." Sarah stepped forward first, shifting James to one arm and extending her free hand with adult dignity. "Welcome to our home, Miss Sullivan. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." The formal greeting touched Margaret's heart. This child had been managing a household and caring for younger siblings, while most girls her age were worried about ribbons and parties. Margaret took her hand warmly. "Thank you, Sarah. Please call me Margaret. And yes, the journey was long, but seeing all of you makes every mile worthwhile." The twins approached next, Michael elbowing Matthew forward as the designated spokesman. "We helped Papa fix up the spare room for you," Matthew announced proudly, "and we didn't break anything this week. Well, not much." "Matthew!" Sarah scolded, but Margaret laughed, genuinely delighted by their honesty. "I appreciate your hard work, boys. I'm sure the room is perfect." Rebecca crept closer, still clutching her paper. Thomas knelt down to her level and spoke softly. "Sweetheart, didn't you make something special for Miss Margaret?" Rebecca nodded mutely and thrust the paper toward Margaret with a sudden movement, then darted back toward the house. Margaret unfolded it carefully, revealing a drawing of a large house surrounded by stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, in careful letters, Rebecca had written, "Welcome home." The simple message hit Margaret harder than she had expected. Home. She had been running from the concept for 3 years, convinced that she would never again belong anywhere or to anyone. Yet here was a child she had never met, offering exactly what Margaret had thought was lost forever. "This is beautiful, Rebecca," Margaret called to the retreating figure. "May I keep it? I'd like to put it in my room." Rebecca peeked back around the doorframe and nodded shyly, a tiny smile flickering across her face before she disappeared inside. Emma remained on the steps, still silent, still watching. Margaret approached slowly and knelt down beside her, careful not to invade the child's space. "Those are lovely flowers, Emma. Did you pick them yourself?" Emma nodded, but didn't speak. Margaret waited patiently, remembering children from her teaching days who had needed time and space to find their words. "I had a flower garden back in Boston," Margaret continued conversationally. "Roses and daisies mostly, but I think wildflowers are prettier. They're brave enough to grow wherever they choose." Something in Emma's expression shifted at those words. She looked down at her flowers, then back at Margaret and slowly extended the wilted bouquet. "Thank you," Margaret said, accepting the gift with the reverence she might show to precious jewels. "These are the most beautiful flowers anyone has ever given me." Emma's face broke into a sudden, radiant smile that transformed her entirely. She popped up from the steps and ran to Thomas, tugging on his sleeve to whisper something in his ear. Whatever she said made him grin and nod enthusiastically. "Emma says you can stay," he announced to Margaret with mock solemnity. "That's high. Praise from our resident flower expert." The ice broken, the children began chattering at once, eager to show Margaret around their home. Sarah led the tour with efficient pride, pointing out the kitchen with its large wood-burning stove, the parlor with hand-carved furniture that spoke of skill and care, and the dining room, where a long table was set for 7. "Papa made most of the furniture himself," Sarah explained. "Uncle William, that was our father, he taught Papa woodworking when they were boys back in Virginia. Papa says keeping busy with his hands helps him think better." The house was comfortable and well-maintained, but Margaret noticed the touches that revealed the absence of a woman's care. Curtains hung slightly crooked. Dishes were clean but mismatched, and everything had the practical, utilitarian feel of a home managed by necessity rather than design. She could see 100 small ways to make the space warmer and more welcoming, improvements that would benefit the entire family. Thomas showed her to the guest room, where she would stay until their wedding, scheduled for the following Saturday. It was simple but clean, with a quilt-covered bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley toward the mountains. Someone, probably Sarah, had placed a small jar of wildflowers on the dresser and folded fresh towels at the foot of the bed. "I know it's not what you're accustomed to," Thomas said quietly, his confidence seeming to waver for the first time. "Since her arrival, it's perfect," Margaret assured him, and meant it. The room was humble but welcoming, and more importantly, it represented acceptance into a family that needed her as much as she needed them. Dinner that evening was a revelation. The children, having overcome their initial shyness, chattered about school, ranch life, and their individual interests. Michael was passionate about horses and could recite the lineage of every animal on the ranch. Matthew preferred mechanical things and had been helping Thomas repair farm equipment since he was old enough to hold a wrench. Sarah displayed a keen interest in household management and had been keeping detailed records of expenses and supplies with impressive accuracy. Rebecca gradually warmed up enough to share stories about her collection of smooth stones, each one found in a different location around the ranch. Emma remained mostly quiet, but listened intently to every conversation, occasionally whispering comments to Thomas that made him smile. Baby James provided entertainment by throwing bits of food and babbling at anyone who would listen. Thomas himself proved to be an engaging conversationalist, well-read despite his frontier lifestyle, and genuinely interested in Margaret's opinions. On everything from literature to politics, he asked thoughtful questions about her teaching experience and listened carefully to her suggestions for helping the children with their studies. As the evening wound down and the children were sent to prepare for bed, Margaret found herself alone with Thomas on the front porch, watching stars appear in the vast sky above. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, and Margaret realized that the man she had come to know through letters was exactly who he had presented himself to be: honest, kind, and deeply committed to the welfare of his family. "They're wonderful children, Thomas," she said softly. "You've done an amazing job with them under impossible circumstances." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripped together as he stared out at the darkening landscape. "I've tried my best, but some days I feel like I'm drowning. Sarah's growing up too fast, trying to be a mother to the others. The twins need more guidance than I know how to give them. Rebecca still has nightmares about losing her parents, and Emma hasn't spoken a full sentence since the day they arrived here 2 years ago, except for what she whispered to me about you today." The weight of responsibility in his voice broke Margaret's heart. This man had sacrificed his own life to care for 6 grieving children, and he was torturing himself with the fear that he wasn't enough for them. "They adore you," Margaret said firmly. "Anyone can see that, and they're healing, Thomas. It just takes time." "I hope you're right," he replied. "I hope I can be the father they deserve and that we can give them the stable home they need." As Margaret prepared for bed in her simple room, she reflected on the day's events. The children were everything Thomas had described and more: resilient, loving, and desperately in need of the security that only a complete family could provide. Thomas himself had exceeded her expectations, proving to be not just a good man, but one who might truly become the partner she had never dared to hope for. But as she brushed her hair and prepared for sleep, the weight of her secret pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. These children had already lost so much. Thomas was clearly a man who valued family above all else. What would happen when they discovered that the woman they were welcoming into their hearts could never give them brothers or sisters, could never fulfill the most basic expectation of a frontier wife? Margaret climbed into bed and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her and the distant lowing of cattle in the darkness. Tomorrow she would begin the process of becoming part of this family, but the shadow of her secret would grow larger with each passing day until she found the courage to reveal the truth. She only hoped that when that moment came, the love she was already beginning to feel for Thomas and his children would be strong enough to survive the revelation. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and boots stomping across the kitchen floor below. She dressed quickly in one of her practical new dresses and made her way downstairs, where she found Thomas already preparing coffee while Sarah bustled around the kitchen, organizing breakfast with military precision. "Good morning," Margaret said softly, not wanting to startle them. "May I help with anything?" Sarah looked up from the griddle where pancakes were already sizzling. "Oh, Miss Margaret, you don't need to—" "Please," Margaret interrupted gently. "I'd like to help, and I meant what I said yesterday about calling me Margaret." Thomas handed her a steaming cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly as she accepted it. "Sarah's been running this kitchen since she was 12, he said with evident pride, "but I'm sure she'd appreciate the assistance." What followed was Margaret's first real test as a potential member of the Garrett household. Sarah had developed an efficient system over 2 years of managing meals for 7 people, but Margaret could see ways to streamline the process even further. She began quietly, setting the table and organizing ingredients, gradually taking on More tasks, as Sarah relaxed enough to accept her help. The twins thundered down the stairs just as the pancakes were ready, followed by Rebecca clutching a well-worn rag doll and Emma carrying a handful of wildflowers that had mysteriously appeared since the previous evening. Baby James toddled into the kitchen in his nightgown, his hair sticking up in impossible directions. Breakfast was cheerfully chaotic. The twins argued about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Emma solemnly arranged her flowers in a cup of water as a centerpiece, and Rebecca whispered detailed instructions to her doll about proper table manners. Thomas managed the controlled mayhem with patient good humor, settling disputes and ensuring everyone ate enough to fuel their day. "Miss Margaret," Michael announced between bites of pancake, "Papa says you're a real teacher. Did you teach mean? Kids who threw spitballs." "Michael," Sarah scolded, but Margaret laughed. "I did encounter a few spitball enthusiasts in my time," she admitted. "The trick is to keep them so interested in the lesson that they forget about causing mischief." "What's the most interesting thing you ever taught?" Matthew asked, suddenly. Animated, Margaret considered the question carefully. "I once taught my students about astronomy by having them map the night sky. We went outside every clear evening for a month, charting the movement of stars and planets. By the end, they could find any constellation and tell you stories about how ancient peoples imagined those patterns in the sky." The children listened with rapt attention, even Emma setting down her fork to focus entirely on Margaret's words. Thomas watched from across the table, something warm and thoughtful in his expression. "Could you teach us about stars?" Rebecca asked quietly, speaking directly to Margaret for the first time. "I'd love to," Margaret replied. "Tonight, if the sky is clear, we could start identifying the brightest constellations." After breakfast, Thomas departed for the day's ranch work, taking the twins with him to help with various chores. Sarah began tackling the weekly laundry, a massive undertaking for a family of 7. Margaret found herself naturally falling into the rhythm of household management, helping to organize tasks and care for James while keeping Rebecca and Emma occupied. The day revealed both the challenges and the joys of frontier life. Water had to be hauled from the well, clothes scrubbed by hand on a washboard, and every meal prepared from basic ingredients. But there was also deep satisfaction in the work, and Margaret discovered that the physical demands left little time. For the brooding that had plagued her in Boston, Emma proved to be an unexpected delight. While she rarely spoke, she communicated through gestures, drawings, and the occasional whispered word. She followed Margaret around the house like a small shadow, helping with simple tasks and showing her where things were kept. When Margaret began humming while she worked, Emma quietly joined in, her sweet voice barely audible but perfectly in tune. Rebecca gradually emerged from her shell as well. She showed Margaret her collection of special stones, explaining in halting sentences where each one had been found and why it was important. The child had an artist's eye for color and texture, and her explanations revealed an intelligence that formal schooling might nurture into something remarkable. That evening, true to her promise, Margaret took the children outside after dinner to explore the night sky. The lack of city lights made the stars brilliant and numerous, creating a celestial display that took her breath away. She pointed out the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia, and Orion, sharing the mythological stories associated with each constellation. "The ancient Greeks believed that Orion was a great hunter," she explained, tracing the pattern with her finger. "They said he was so skilled that he could kill any creature on earth. But the gods thought he was becoming too proud, so they sent a scorpion to humble him. Now Orion and Scorpius chase each other across the sky for eternity, never appearing in the heavens at the same time." "That's sad," Rebecca observed. "They could have been friends instead of enemies." "You're absolutely right," Margaret agreed. It shows how pride and stubbornness can turn potential allies into adversaries. Thomas joined them on the porch, settling into a chair beside Margaret as the children sprawled on blankets spread across the wooden boards. In the darkness, with the vast sky overhead and the peaceful sounds of the ranch around them, Margaret felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. "You're a natural teacher," Thomas said quietly when the children had grown drowsy and begun to drift inside. "They've learned more astronomy in one evening than in months of scattered lessons." "They're bright children," Margaret replied. "They just need someone to nurture their curiosity." "Is that what you miss most about teaching?" "The chance to open young minds to new ideas." Margaret considered the question. "I miss the moment when understanding dawns in a child's eyes. There's nothing quite like seeing someone discover that they're capable of more than they imagined." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion. "These children have been through more than any young person should endure. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough to help them heal and grow." "You're doing more than enough," Margaret said firmly. "You've given them safety, love, and stability. Everything else will follow in time." The next few days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Margaret found herself naturally integrating into the household routines, her teaching skills proving invaluable in helping the children with their studies. She worked with Sarah on advanced mathematics and literature, coached the twins through their reading assignments, and spent patient hours helping Rebecca overcome her fear of writing. Emma remained largely silent, but she began bringing Margaret small gifts, a particularly perfect leaf, a smooth piece of wood, and a feather from one of the ranch's peacocks. Each offering was presented with a shy ceremony, and Margaret accepted them with the reverence they deserved. Baby James took to following Margaret around the house, babbling happily and reaching for her whenever she came into view. She found herself naturally falling into the role of caregiver, singing to him while she worked, and including him in simple activities that delighted his toddler sensibilities. The wedding preparations began in earnest. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, the minister's wife and unofficial social coordinator for Cedar Ridge, arrived at the ranch with her arms full of fabric samples and her head full of opinions about proper frontier wedding etiquette. "Now, my dear," she announced to Margaret, "I know you've come from the big city, but out here we keep things simple and practical. A nice dress that you can wear again for church and special occasions. Nothing too fancy that will make the other ladies feel inadequate." Margaret found herself genuinely charmed by Mrs. Fletcher's no-nonsense approach. The older woman had the gift of organization and the determination to see any project through to completion. Within hours, she had measured Margaret for a wedding dress, planned the ceremony details, and organized a modest reception to follow. "Thomas Garrett is one of the finest men in this territory," Mrs. Fletcher confided as she pinned fabric around Margaret's waist. "Lost his own wife in childbirth 5 years ago, you know. Tragic business. Then when his brother William and sister-in-law Catherine died in that influenza outbreak, Thomas took in all 6 children without a moment's hesitation. Not many men would sacrifice their own prospects to raise someone else's family." The casual revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Thomas had been married before and had lost his wife in childbirth. The pain of that loss, combined with his current commitment to his brother's children, made Margaret's secret feel even more devastating. How could she tell a man who had already experienced such tragedy that she could never give him children of their own? That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret found Thomas on the front porch, as had become their custom. The wedding was only 2 days away, and the weight of her deception was becoming unbearable. "Thomas," she began carefully, "Mrs. Fletcher mentioned that you were married before. I'm sorry for your loss." Thomas was quiet for a long time, his hands clasped as he stared out at the star-filled sky. "Her name was Catherine, same as my sister-in-law, which caused some confusion when William married Catherine." She was a good woman, kind and gentle. We were happy for the 3 years we were married. What happened? Margaret asked softly. The baby came early, and there were complications. Dr. Morrison tried everything he knew, but we didn't have anyone with real medical training back then. Both Catherine and the baby died within hours of each other. His voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For a long time, I thought I'd never marry again. The grief was overwhelming. But when William and his Catherine died, and I suddenly had 6 children to raise, I realized that my own sorrow was less important than their needs. They've lost enough. They deserve a stable home with 2 parents who can give them the love and guidance they need." Margaret's heart ached with the knowledge that she was deceiving this good man who had already endured so much loss. She opened her mouth to tell him the truth, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she destroy his hopes and the children's dreams of finally having a complete family? "Margaret," Thomas said, turning to face her in the darkness, "I want you to know that I don't expect this marriage to be a romantic fairy tale. We're both practical people entering into a partnership for mutual benefit. But I hope that over time we might find genuine affection and companionship with each other." His honesty both touched and tortured Margaret. Here was a man offering her exactly what she had dreamed of: acceptance, partnership, and the chance to be part of a loving family. All she had to do was continue living a lie that grew heavier with each passing day. "I hope so too," she managed to say, the words feeling like ashes in her mouth. The next day brought a flurry of final preparations. Margaret's wedding dress was completed, a beautiful creation in deep blue wool that complemented her eyes and could indeed be worn again for special occasions. Sarah helped her arrange her hair in an elaborate style that made her look both elegant and approachable. The twins practiced their roles as unofficial ushers. Rebecca perfected her curtsy for meeting the other ladies of the town, and Emma picked an enormous bouquet of wildflowers that she insisted Margaret must carry. Dr. Helen Blackwood stopped by to introduce herself and offer her services as both physician and friend. She was a remarkable woman, confident, intelligent, and clearly beloved by the entire community, despite the initial skepticism about a female. "Doctor, I understand you're from Boston," Dr. Blackwood said as they shared tea in the parlor. "I trained there myself at the Women's Medical College. It's a wonderful city, but I've found the frontier offers opportunities for women that simply don't exist in more established places." "What made you decide to come west?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "Freedom," Dr. Blackwood replied simply. "Back east, I would have spent my career fighting for the right to practice medicine. Out here, people care more about competence than convention. When someone's been shot or their child has a fever, they don't question whether the person treating them wears skirts or trousers." Her words resonated with Margaret, who had felt similarly constrained by Boston's rigid social expectations. Perhaps there was hope for building a new kind of life in this place, where necessity mattered more than propriety. As the sun set on the eve of her wedding, Margaret stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the ranch that would soon be her home. The children were excited about the ceremony. Thomas was patient and kind, and the community had welcomed her with genuine warmth. Everything was perfect, except for the secret that gnawed at her conscience like a physical pain. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Thomas Garrett, stepmother to 6 wonderful children and partner to a man who deserved nothing but honesty from the woman he was taking as his wife. The weight of her deception felt crushing, but it was too late to turn back now. All she could do was pray that when the truth finally emerged, the bonds they were building would be strong enough to survive the revelation. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through Margaret's bedroom window and painting golden rectangles across the wooden floor. She had barely slept, her mind churning with anticipation and guilt in equal measure. Today she would become Thomas Garrett's wife, and with each passing hour, her secret felt like a stone growing heavier in her chest. Sarah knocked softly on her door at 7 o'clock, carrying a breakfast tray and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Margaret, you need to eat something. Mrs. Fletcher says brides who don't eat faint during the ceremony, and that would be terribly embarrassing for everyone." Margaret managed to smile at the girl's earnest concern. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're taking very good care of me." As Margaret picked at her eggs and toast, Sarah chattered about the preparations happening throughout the house. The twins had been up since dawn, polishing their shoes and arguing about whether their hair looked better slicked down or left natural. Rebecca had awakened with a case of nervous giggles and couldn't stop practicing her curtsy. Emma had disappeared, entirely, probably hiding in her favorite spot behind the kitchen stove with her latest collection of treasures. "Papa's been pacing the porch since sunrise," Sarah confided. "I think he's more nervous than you are. He keeps checking his pocket watch and muttering about whether the minister will arrive on time." The image of Thomas pacing nervously brought a genuine smile to Margaret's face. It was oddly comforting to know that he was experiencing his own pre-wedding jitters. Mrs. Fletcher arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, armed with curling irons, hairpins, and enough nervous energy to power the entire ranch. She swept into Margaret's room like a general preparing for battle, immediately beginning the transformation from everyday Margaret into bride Margaret. "Now, dear, we'll do your hair in a style that's fashionable but not too elaborate for Cedar Ridge standards," Mrs. Fletcher announced, wielding a brush with practiced efficiency. "You want to look lovely, but not like you're putting on airs." And Mrs. Fletcher worked. Other ladies from town began arriving to help with preparations. Mrs. Sarah Morrison, from the general store, brought a delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Mrs. Elizabeth Cooper, the schoolteacher, offered a pair of elegant gloves that would complement the blue wedding dress perfectly. Even Dr. Blackwood appeared, carrying a small bouquet of late-blooming roses from her own garden. "Every bride needs something special for her wedding day," Dr. Blackwood explained, presenting the roses with a warm smile. "These are particularly hardy. They've survived 2 early frosts and are still blooming. Rather like frontier women. Wouldn't you say?" The kindness of these women, most of whom Margaret had met only briefly, overwhelmed her. In Boston, her social circle had shrunk to nothing after her broken engagement. Here, she was being welcomed into a community with genuine warmth and generosity. By noon, Margaret was transformed. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant but simple style, with small pearl pins catching the light. The blue wool dress fit perfectly, its rich color bringing out the green in her hazel eyes. Mrs. Morrison's pearl necklace added just the right touch of elegance, and Dr. Blackwood's roses provided a splash of color against the deep blue fabric. "You look beautiful," Sarah breathed, her 14-year-old eyes shining with something approaching reverence. "Papa's going to be so happy." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sarah's innocent faith in this marriage, in the happiness it would bring to her beloved father figure, made Margaret's deception feel even more cruel. How could she continue this charade, knowing that she was building their joy on a foundation of lies? The ceremony was to take place at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the parlor of the ranch house. Reverend Fletcher had arrived an hour early to discuss the service details with Thomas, and Margaret could hear their low voices through the floor as she made final preparations in her room. At 15 minutes before 2, there was a soft knock on her door. "Margaret," Thomas's voice was muffled but clearly nervous, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret opened the door to find Thomas standing in the hallway, looking handsome but uncomfortable in his best suit. His usually steady hands were fidgeting with his hat, and his hair showed evidence of multiple attempts at taming. "You look," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "You look beautiful, Margaret. Truly beautiful." "Thank you," she whispered, touched by the genuine admiration. "In his eyes, I wanted to give you this," he continued, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "It belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for the woman I married." Margaret unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. The locket was engraved with a pattern of tiny flowers and opened to reveal a miniature photograph of a woman with Thomas's eyes and kind smile. "It's lovely," Margaret managed, though her throat was tight with emotion. "Are you sure you want me to have it?" "I can't think of anyone who would honor her memory better," Thomas replied softly. "May I?" He stepped behind her and carefully fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle as they brushed against her skin. The intimacy of the gesture, combined with the weight of the locket and all it represented, nearly brought Margaret to tears. "Thomas," she began, the moment seeming right for confession, "there's something I need to tell you." "Papa!" "Margaret!" Matthew's voice echoed up the stairs. "Reverend Fletcher says it's time. Everyone's ready." The moment shattered, and Thomas stepped back with a gentle smile. "We should go. The children are so excited they might burst if we delay any longer." Margaret nodded, swallowing the words that had been on the tip of her tongue. Later, she promised herself, after the ceremony, when they had a moment alone, she would find the courage to tell him everything. The parlor had been transformed for the occasion. Mrs. Fletcher had arranged chairs for the small gathering of guests. Dr. Blackwood, the Morrisons, the Coopers, and a few other prominent families from town. The children were arranged in the front row, all scrubbed and polished to perfection. Emma had emerged from hiding and sat between the twins, clutching her wildflower bouquet with fierce determination. Rebecca perched on the edge of her chair, her collection of special stones arranged in her lap for luck. Sarah held baby James, who was miraculously calm and alert for such an important moment. Reverend Fletcher stood at the front of the room, his weathered face kind but appropriately solemn for the occasion. Thomas took his place beside the minister, his earlier nervousness replaced by steady calm now that the moment had arrived. Margaret entered the parlor on Mrs. Fletcher's arm, since there was no father or family member present to perform the traditional duty. The assembled guests rose respectfully, and Margaret heard several soft murmurs of approval for her appearance. But her eyes were fixed on Thomas, whose face lit up with such genuine joy at the sight of her that her heart ached with the magnitude of her deception. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Reverend Fletcher spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, the importance of commitment and mutual support, and the special blessing of bringing together a family of children who needed love and stability. His words were clearly chosen with this particular union in mind, acknowledging both the practical and emotional aspects of what Thomas and Margaret were undertaking. When it came time for vows, Thomas spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I, Thomas William Garrett, take you, Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to cherish and protect you, to be your partner in all things, and to love you faithfully for all the days of my life." Margaret's own vows felt like they were being torn from her soul. "I, Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan, take you, Thomas William Garrett, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by your side through joy and sorrow, to care for your family as my own, and to love you with all my heart for as long as I live." The words were true, she realized with startling clarity. Despite the secret she carried, despite the deception that had brought her here, she did love this man and these children. She loved Thomas's gentle strength, his devotion to his family, his quiet wisdom and steady kindness. She loved Sarah's mature responsibility, mixed with glimpses of the girl she should be allowed to be. She loved the twins' irrepressible energy and curiosity, Rebecca's artistic soul wrapped in protective shyness, Emma's mysterious depths and precious moments of connection, and baby James's innocent joy in simply existing. The realization that her feelings were genuine made her deception feel even more unbearable. She wasn't just lying to strangers anymore. She was lying to people she had come to love desperately. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Reverend Fletcher announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." Thomas stepped closer, his hands gentle as they framed her face. The kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise and hope for their future together. When they broke apart, Margaret saw her own emotions reflected. In his eyes, love, commitment, and the determination to build something beautiful together. The parlor erupted in applause and celebration. The children rushed forward to embrace their new stepmother, the guests offered congratulations and best wishes, and Mrs. Fletcher immediately began organizing the reception that would follow. In the midst of the joyful chaos, Margaret felt both, completely part of the family and utterly isolated by her secret. The reception was a warm community affair. Tables had been set up on the front porch, laden with dishes, contributed by various townspeople. There was roasted chicken from the Morrisons, fresh bread from the bakery, vegetables from several kitchen gardens, and a beautiful cake that Mrs. Hooper had somehow managed to create despite the limitations of frontier baking. Margaret found herself the center of attention as the women of Cedar Ridge took turns welcoming her officially to their community. They shared advice about everything, from managing a household at altitude to the best remedies for childhood ailments. Their acceptance was genuine and immediate, and Margaret realized that she was gaining not just a husband and children, but an entire support network of strong, capable women. Dr. Blackwood pulled her aside during a quiet moment, her expression thoughtful. "Margaret, I hope you know that you can come to me with any concerns or questions, medical or otherwise. Sometimes it helps to have another woman to talk to, especially when adjusting to a new life." The offer was clearly well-intentioned, but it made Margaret's stomach clench with anxiety. Dr. Blackwood was intelligent and perceptive. Would she eventually discover Margaret's secret through routine medical care? As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued around them, Margaret found moments to observe her new family. Thomas moved through the gathering with quiet confidence, accepting congratulations and clearly pleased with how the day was unfolding. The children basked in the attention and the special nature of the occasion, but Margaret noticed how they stayed close to either her or Thomas, as if needing reassurance that this happiness was real and permanent. Emma surprised everyone by speaking directly to Mrs. Morrison, clearly stating that Margaret was now her mama and asking if that meant she could have a piece of cake. The simple declaration brought tears to several eyes and marked a breakthrough in the little girl's healing process. Rebecca presented Margaret with a special stone she had found that morning, a piece of quartz with a vein of gold running through. It's for luck," she explained solemnly, "for our family." The twins regaled anyone who would listen with detailed plans for all the adventures they would have now that Margaret was officially their stepmother, including camping trips, fishing expeditions, and elaborate construction projects around the ranch. Sarah quietly managed the practical aspects of the reception with remarkable skill, ensuring that guests were fed and comfortable while keeping track of the younger children. But Margaret caught moments when the 14-year-old allowed herself to simply be a child, laughing at the twins' antics or sneaking extra cake when she thought no one was looking. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Margaret helped clean up while mentally preparing for her first night as Thomas's wife. They had discussed the practical arrangements beforehand. She would move her belongings to the master bedroom, and they would begin the process of truly becoming a family unit. But as she folded tablecloths and gathered dishes, the weight of Her secret felt crushing. She was now legally bound to a man who had every right to expect honesty from his wife, living in a house with children who deserved to know the truth about the woman they were calling mother. The children were finally persuaded to go to bed, though their excitement made the process take twice as long as usual. One by one, they hugged Margaret goodnight, each embrace feeling like both a blessing and an accusation. When baby James reached for her with sleepy arms and snuggled against her shoulder, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying. Finally, the house was quiet, and Margaret found herself alone with Thomas in the parlor where they had been married just hours earlier. The reality of their situation, husband and wife, partners in raising 6 children, committed to building a life together, settled around them like a tangible presence. "It was a beautiful day," Thomas said softly, reaching for her hand. "Thank you for making it perfect." Margaret squeezed his fingers, knowing that this moment of peace was borrowed time. Soon, very soon, she would have to find the courage to tell him the truth about why she had really come to Cedar Ridge. She only hoped that the love they had already begun to build would be strong enough to survive the revelation that their marriage was founded on a lie that grew more devastating with each passing day. 3 weeks into their marriage, Margaret had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. The morning chores became second nature, starting the coffee before dawn, preparing breakfast for 7 people, packing lunches for Thomas and the older children who helped with ranch work. Her teaching background proved invaluable in organizing the household chaos, and she found deep satisfaction in bringing order and warmth to the Garrett home. The children had embraced her presence with an enthusiasm that both delighted and terrified her. Sarah had gradually relinquished some of her household responsibilities, allowing herself to be more of a teenager and less of a substitute mother. The twins followed Margaret around like devoted puppies, eager to help with any task and constantly seeking her approval for their various projects. Rebecca had begun speaking more freely, sharing stories about her dreams and fears with a trust that made Margaret's heart ache. Emma had started calling her Mama Margaret in her whispered conversations, and baby James had taken to crying whenever Margaret left his sight for more than a few minutes. It was this very closeness that made Margaret's secret feel like a poison, spreading through her veins. Every affectionate gesture, every moment of family happiness, every sign of the children's healing felt tainted by her deception. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, while Thomas slept peacefully beside her, wrestling with the knowledge that she was living a lie that grew more damaging with each passing day. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning, in late October, when Dr. Blackwood arrived unexpectedly at the ranch. Margaret was in the kitchen, teaching Rebecca how to make bread, when she heard the sound of a buggy approaching. Through the window, she saw the familiar figure of the doctor climbing down from her carriage, her medical bag in hand, and her expression serious. "Mrs. Garrett," Dr. Blackwood called as she approached the house, "I need to speak with you about a medical matter concerning the family." Margaret's blood turned to ice. Had the doctor somehow discovered her secret? Had she been careless in some way that revealed her condition? With trembling hands, she wiped the flour from her fingers and stepped onto the porch to greet their visitor. "Dr. Blackwood, what brings you out here? Is someone ill?" "Not exactly," the doctor replied, her keen eyes studying Margaret's face. "I've just received some concerning news from the Territorial Health Office in Cheyenne. There have been several cases of scarlet fever reported in the mining camps east of here. 3 children have died, and the authorities are worried about it spreading to the surrounding communities." Relief flooded through Margaret so powerfully that she had to grip the porch railing to steady herself. Dr. Blackwood's visit had nothing to do with her secret. It was about protecting the children from disease. "What do we need to do?" Margaret asked, immediately shifting into protective mode. I'm visiting all the families with children to discuss prevention measures, Dr. Blackwood explained. Scarlet fever is highly contagious and can be particularly dangerous for young children. I want to examine all 6 of your children and make sure they're healthy, then discuss the signs to watch for. Margaret called the children in from their various activities, and Dr. Blackwood set up an impromptu clinic in the parlor. One by one, she examined each child thoroughly, checking their throats, listening to their breathing, and asking detailed questions about their recent health. They're all in excellent condition, she announced when the examinations were complete. You're doing a wonderful job caring for them, Margaret. Their nutrition is good. They're all at healthy weights, and I can see they're thriving under your care. The praise should have warmed Margaret's heart, but instead it made her guilt intensify. Dr. Blackwood continued with her instructions about monitoring for fever, sore throat, and the characteristic rash that gave scarlet fever its name. She left detailed written instructions and promised to return weekly to check on the family until the outbreak was contained. As the doctor prepared to leave, she paused at the door and looked at Margaret with a thoughtful expression. You know, Margaret, you have such a natural way with children. It's clear that motherhood comes easily to you. I imagine you and Thomas will be expanding your family before too long. The casual comment hit Margaret like a physical blow. She managed to nod and mumble something non-committal. But as soon as Dr. Blackwood's buggy disappeared down the road, Margaret fled to the barn and broke down in tears. She sobbed for everything she couldn't have, for the children she could never bear, for the lies she was living, and for the inevitable moment when her deception would destroy the happiness they had all worked so hard to build. The weight of pretending to be someone she wasn't had become unbearable. Margaret. Thomas's voice came from the barn entrance, filled with concern. Sweetheart, what's wrong? She looked up to find him approaching slowly, his face creased with worry. His kindness only made her cry harder, and when he knelt beside her in the hay and pulled her into his arms, she nearly confessed everything right then and there. I'm sorry, she choked out. I don't know what's wrong with me. Dr. Blackwood's visit just reminded me how much the children mean to me, and the thought of anything happening to them. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Thomas held her gently, stroking her hair and murmuring soothing words until her tears subsided. You love them so much, he said softly. Sometimes I watch you with them, and I'm amazed by how natural you are as a mother. It's like you were meant to be part of our family. His words were meant to comfort, but they felt like daggers to Margaret's heart. She pulled back slightly to look at his face, memorizing every detail of his expression in this moment of peace before she shattered it forever. Thomas, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, there's something I need to tell you. Something important that I should have shared before we married. Something in her tone must have alerted him to the gravity of the moment, because his expression grew serious, and he took her hands in his. What is it, Margaret? Whatever it is, we can face it together. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form the words, Emma's voice rang out across the barnyard. Mama Margaret, come quick, James is being sick. The moment shattered as both Margaret and Thomas leaped to their feet and rushed toward the house. They found baby James in Sarah's arms, his face flushed with fever and his small body limp with exhaustion. Dr. Blackwood's warnings about scarlet fever echoed in Margaret's mind as she felt the child's burning forehead. How long has he been like this? Thomas asked Sarah, his voice tight with concern. He seemed fine at lunch, but when I went to get him from his nap he was crying and burning up, Sarah replied, her 14-year-old composure cracking with worry. Margaret's confession was forgotten as she shifted into emergency mode. Sarah, fetch Dr. Blackwood if she hasn't gotten too far. Thomas, we need to get James cooled down and isolated from the other children until we know what we're dealing with. The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Blackwood returned quickly and conducted a thorough examination of baby James, checking for the telltale signs of scarlet fever while Margaret and Thomas hovered anxiously nearby. "It's not scarlet fever," she finally announced, and the relief in the room was palpable. "It appears to be a simple childhood fever, probably from teething combined with a minor infection. He'll need careful monitoring and plenty of fluids, but he should recover completely within a few days." Margaret threw herself into caring for the sick baby with an intensity that surprised even her. She sat up through the night, cooling his fever with damp cloths, coaxing him to drink water, and singing soft lullabies when he fretted. Thomas took turns with the night watch, and together they nursed James through the worst of his illness. By the third day, the baby's fever had broken, and he was beginning to eat normally again. Margaret felt triumphant as she watched him playing with his wooden blocks, babbling happily and reaching for her with chubby arms that were no longer burning with fever. "You were magnificent," Thomas told her as they stood together watching James play. "The way you cared for him, stayed calm in the crisis, knew exactly what to do. You're a natural mother, Margaret. This family is so lucky to have you." The praise that should have filled her with joy instead made Margaret feel physically ill. Every compliment, every expression of gratitude, every sign of the family's love and trust felt like another weight added to the crushing burden of her deception. That evening, after the children were asleep and James was resting peacefully, Margaret found herself alone with Thomas in their bedroom for the first time since the crisis began. He was exhausted from 3 nights of broken sleep, but his relief at James's recovery was evident in every line of his body. "Margaret," he said as he prepared for bed, "I've been thinking about what you started to tell me in the barn before James got sick. You said there was something important you needed to share with me." Margaret's heart began racing. The moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had finally arrived. There would be no more interruptions, no more excuses to delay the truth. She sat on the edge of their bed, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "Yes," she whispered, "there is something you need to know, something I should have told you before we married." Thomas sat beside her, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Whatever it is, we can work through it together. I love you, Margaret, and nothing you could tell me would change that." His faith in their relationship, his absolute trust in her, made what she had to do even more agonizing. Margaret took a shuddering breath and forced herself to meet his eyes. "Thomas, the reason I left Boston, the real reason I answered your advertisement, it wasn't just because of social scandal or a broken engagement. There was something else, something medical that made it impossible for me to have the life I had planned there." She paused, watching his face for any sign of understanding, but he simply waited patiently for her to continue. 3 years ago, I had a severe fever that nearly killed me. The doctors saved my life, but there were complications, permanent damage that means—" She stopped, her throat closing around the words she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "What kind of damage, Margaret?" Thomas asked gently. "I can't have children," she whispered, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "The fever left me barren. I will never be able to give you children of your own, Thomas, never." The silence that followed was the longest of Margaret's life. She watched Thomas's face as he processed her words, saw the moment when understanding dawned, followed by something that might have been pain or disappointment or both. "You've known this the entire time?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Yes, since before I answered your advertisement. I knew when I wrote my first letter, when I accepted your proposal, when I married you 3 weeks ago. I knew, and I didn't tell you because I was afraid you wouldn't want me if you knew the truth." Thomas stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her as he stared out at the darkness beyond. Margaret remained frozen on the bed, hardly daring to breathe as she waited for his response. "All this time," he said quietly, You've been living with this secret, carrying this burden alone. I wanted to tell you so many times, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Every day that passed made it harder, but I was terrified of losing this family, of losing you and the children. I know how selfish that was, how wrong, but I love you all so much that I couldn't bear the thought of walking away. Thomas turned back to face her, and Margaret was startled to see that his expression wasn't angry or disgusted. It was infinitely sad. "Margaret," he said softly, "do you really think so little of me that you believed I would reject you for something completely beyond your control?" The question caught her off guard. What? Did you think I married you only because I wanted more children? That your value to this family depended entirely on your ability to bear babies?" Margaret stared at him, confused by his response. This wasn't the reaction she had expected, not the anger, the sense of betrayal, the demand that she leave immediately. "I don't understand," she whispered. Thomas sat back down beside her, his movements careful and deliberate. "Margaret, I already have 6 children who need love, guidance, and stability. 6 children who were broken and healing when you arrived, and who are now thriving under your care. Why would I need or want more children when these 6 fill our lives so completely?" The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret realized that she had been so focused on her own shame and fear that she had never considered this perspective. "But most men want heirs," she protested weakly. "I'm not most men," Thomas replied firmly, "and these children are my heirs in every way that matters. They carry the Garrett name, they'll inherit this ranch, and they're already the family I want to spend my life raising." Margaret felt something inside her chest beginning to crack open, a hard, painful knot of shame and fear that she had carried for 3 years. You're not angry that I deceived you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I'm hurt that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth from the beginning. I'm sad that you've been carrying this burden alone, feeling like you had to earn your place in our family through deception. But angry? No, Margaret, I'm not angry. I was so afraid," she whispered, tears beginning to flow again. "In Boston, when my fiancé learned the truth, he cast me aside like I was damaged goods. I thought all men would react the same way. Your former fiancé was a fool," Thomas said with quiet conviction. "Any man who would reject a woman as loving and capable as you over something completely beyond your control doesn't deserve to have you in his life." For the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt the crushing weight of shame beginning to lift from her shoulders. She looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and saw nothing but love and acceptance in his eyes. "Can you forgive me for not trusting you with the truth?" she asked. Thomas reached for her hands, covering them with his own. "There's nothing to forgive, Margaret. You've been the answer to our prayers from the moment you arrived. You've brought healing to our children, joy to our home, and love to my heart. The fact that you can't bear children doesn't change any of that." Margaret fell into his arms then, sobbing with relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming emotion of finally being accepted exactly as she was. For the first time since Dr. Whitmore had delivered his devastating diagnosis, she felt whole and worthy of love. As Thomas held her and whispered words of comfort and reassurance, Margaret realized that she had found something she had never dared to hope for, a man who valued her for who she was rather than what she could give him, and a family that needed her exactly as much as she needed them. The secret that had driven her from Boston and nearly destroyed her happiness in Cedar Ridge was finally revealed. And instead of ending her new life, it had freed her to embrace it completely. The weeks following Margaret's confession brought a transformation to the Garrett household that was both subtle and profound. With the weight of her secret finally lifted, Margaret found herself able to embrace her role as wife and mother with a freedom she had never experienced before. The constant anxiety that had shadowed her every interaction with the family dissolved, replaced by a deep sense of belonging and purpose. The children, sensitive to the emotional undercurrents of their home, seemed to sense the change immediately. Sarah began seeking Margaret's advice on matters beyond household management, questions about her changing body, her dreams for the future, and the complicated feelings that came with being a young woman on the frontier. The conversations they shared while working together in the kitchen or tending the garden created a bond that went far deeper than mere stepmother and stepdaughter. "Margaret," Sarah said one afternoon, as they preserved the last of the autumn. "Harvest, do you think I could become a teacher like you were? I love working with the younger children, and Mrs. Cooper says I have a gift for explaining things." Margaret looked up from the apple she was peeling, her heart swelling with pride and affection. "I think you would make an excellent teacher. Sarah, you have patience, intelligence, and natural leadership abilities. Those are the most important qualifications for the profession. But would Papa approve? He's invested so much in the ranch, and I know he expects me to help manage it." "Your father wants you to be happy and fulfilled," Margaret replied firmly. "Teaching doesn't mean you couldn't also be involved with the ranch. Many frontier women balance multiple roles. We should discuss it with him. I think you might be surprised by his response." The twins had begun including Margaret in their elaborate plans and schemes, with an enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed but always delighted her. They dragged her to see their latest construction project, a treehouse that defied several laws of physics, but somehow remained standing. They presented her with detailed drawings of inventions they planned to build, sought her opinion on the best locations for various adventures, and generally treated her as an essential partner in all their endeavors. "Mama Margaret," Michael announced one morning at breakfast, "Matthew and I have decided that you need to learn how to ride properly. Papa's been teaching you on Buttercup, but she's too gentle. You need to ride Thunder." Thunder was Thomas's spirited stallion, definitely not appropriate for a novice rider. Margaret caught Thomas's eye across the table and saw his barely suppressed laughter. "I think Buttercup and I are getting along quite well," Margaret replied diplomatically. "Perhaps Thunder can wait until I've mastered the basics." "But Mama Margaret," Matthew protested, "how are you going to help us round up cattle in the spring if you can't handle a real horse?" The assumption that she would be participating in cattle roundups touched Margaret deeply. To the twins, she wasn't just their stepmother, she was a full partner in ranch life, expected to participate in all aspects of their family business. Rebecca had blossomed under Margaret's gentle encouragement, her artistic talents emerging with stunning clarity. Margaret had discovered the child's gift for detailed observation, and had begun encouraging her to document the wildlife and plant life around the ranch. Rebecca's drawings were becoming increasingly sophisticated, showing a natural understanding of light, shadow, and proportion that suggested real artistic potential. "Look, Margaret," Rebecca said one evening, shyly presenting her latest creation. "I drew the sunset over the mountains like you taught me, paying attention to how the colors change." The drawing was breathtaking, a landscape that captured not just the visual beauty of their surroundings, but the emotional impact of watching day turn to night in the Wyoming wilderness. Margaret studied it with genuine awe. "Rebecca, this is extraordinary. You've captured something that many artists spend years trying to achieve. The way you've shown the light falling across the peaks, the subtle color variations in the sky, it's truly gifted work." The child's face lit up with pride and pleasure. "Do you really think so? I want to make a whole book of drawings showing how the ranch looks in different seasons." "I think that's a wonderful project," Margaret encouraged. "We should talk to your father about getting you some proper art supplies from Denver." Emma's progress was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The little girl, who had been nearly mute when Margaret arrived, was now chattering constantly, her reservoir of stored-up words and thoughts finally finding expression. She followed Margaret everywhere, narrating her observations about everything, from the behavior of the chickens to the patterns she saw in cloud formations. "Mama Margaret," Emma said one morning as they gathered eggs together, "do you think the chickens dream? Because sometimes they make little peeping sounds when they're sleeping, like they're talking to someone." "That's a very thoughtful question. Emma, I think chickens might dream about finding especially delicious bugs or flying higher than they can when they're awake. What do you think they dream about?" Emma considered this seriously as she carefully placed eggs in their basket. "I think they dream about being beautiful birds with long tails that sparkle in the sunshine, and everyone tells them how pretty they are." The insight into Emma's own desires to be seen as beautiful and worthy of admiration revealed the deep thinking happening behind her previously silent exterior. Margaret made a mental note to find ways to help Emma feel special and valued for her unique qualities. Baby James had become Margaret's devoted shadow, crying whenever she left his sight and developing an impressive vocabulary that consisted primarily of variations on mama. His complete trust and affection filled a void in Margaret's heart that she hadn't even realized existed. Thomas watched these developing relationships with evident satisfaction and growing love for the woman who had transformed their household. The initial relief and acceptance he had shown after Margaret's confession had deepened into something far more profound, a recognition that their marriage had become exactly what he had hoped for when he first placed his advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News. "You know," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the children play in the yard, "I never imagined it could be like this." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, settling more comfortably into the chair beside him. "This feeling of completeness. When Catherine died, I thought I'd never have a real family again. Then when William and Catherine passed, and I suddenly had 6 children depending on me, I was so focused on just surviving each day that I couldn't imagine ever finding joy in it. But watching you with them, seeing how they've flourished under your care, it's more than I dared to hope for." Margaret reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become natural and comforting. "They were already wonderful children, Thomas. They just needed someone to help them heal and believe in themselves again." "They needed a mother," Thomas said simply, "and I needed a partner. I'm grateful every day that you had the courage to answer my advertisement, even carrying the burden you were struggling with." The peaceful moment was interrupted by a commotion from the yard, where the twins had apparently convinced Rebecca and Emma to participate in some sort of elaborate game that involved much running, shouting, and laughter. Sarah stood to the side, with James on her hip, calling out warnings about staying away from the well and not tracking mud into the house. "I should probably intervene before someone gets hurt," Margaret said, but she made no move to leave her chair. "They're fine," Thomas replied, squeezing her hand. "Sarah has everything under control, and they need to blow off energy before bedtime. Besides, I'm enjoying this rare moment of peace with my wife." The word wife still sent a small thrill through Margaret's heart. After 3 years of believing she would never belong to anyone or anywhere, she had found both a place and a person who valued her exactly as she was. Their peaceful evening was interrupted by the sound of an approaching horse. A rider materialized out of the gathering dusk, young Billy Morrison from town, riding hard and looking urgent. "Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Garrett," he called as he pulled up in front of the porch. "Dr. Blackwood sent me to fetch you. There's been an accident at the Morrison mine. Cave-in trapped 3 men, and she needs all the help she can get." Thomas was on his feet immediately. "How bad is it, Billy?" "Bad enough that she's asking for anyone with medical training or steady hands. She said to tell Mrs. Garrett that she could use another woman who knows how to keep calm in a crisis." Margaret felt a surge of pride that Dr. Blackwood had specifically requested her assistance. "Of course I'll come. Sarah, can you manage the children?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, already moving into action. We'll get everyone ready for bed and keep the house running until you get back." Within minutes, Margaret and Thomas were mounted and riding toward town, following Billy Morrison through the darkness. The mine was located several miles beyond Cedar Ridge, in a narrow canyon where the Morrison family had been extracting silver for the past 5 years. They arrived to find organized chaos. Dr. Blackwood had set up a makeshift medical station near the mine entrance, with lanterns providing light and volunteers bringing supplies. 2 of the trapped miners had already been extracted, one with a broken leg, another with severe cuts from falling rocks. But the 3rd man was still trapped deeper in the mine, and the rescue efforts were complicated by the instability of the remaining structure. "Margaret, thank God you're here," Dr. Blackwood called out when she spotted them. "I need someone with steady hands to help me set this broken leg. The bone is badly displaced, and I need an assistant who won't faint at the sight of blood." Margaret threw herself into the medical emergency with the same focus she had brought to caring for baby James during his fever. She followed Dr. Blackwood's instructions precisely, holding broken bones in alignment while the doctor worked, keeping injured men calm during painful procedures, and organizing supplies to ensure everything needed was within reach. "You're a natural at this," Dr. Blackwood murmured, as they worked together to stabilize the miner with the broken leg. "Have you considered formal medical training? There's a desperate need for trained medical personnel out here, and you have excellent instincts." The suggestion planted a seed in Margaret's mind that would continue growing in the weeks to come. She had always been drawn to healing and helping others, but the rigid social expectations of Boston had never allowed her to consider medicine as a possibility for herself. The rescue operation continued through the night. Thomas joined the team of volunteers working to extract the 3rd trapped miner, using his engineering knowledge to help shore up the unstable tunnel. Margaret remained at Dr. Blackwood's side, learning more about practical frontier medicine. In one night than she had ever imagined possible, by dawn all 3 miners had been extracted alive, though seriously injured. The man who had been trapped longest would need months of recovery, but Dr. Blackwood was confident that all 3 would survive. As the medical team finally packed up their supplies and prepared to return to town, Margaret felt exhilarated despite her exhaustion. "Thank you for requesting my help," she told Dr. Blackwood as they loaded the last of the medical equipment. "It felt good to be useful in a crisis." "You were more than useful. You were essential," Dr. Blackwood replied. "I meant what I said. About medical training, Margaret. You have natural talent that could be developed into real expertise. Think about it." The ride home was quiet, both Margaret and Thomas lost in their own thoughts about the night's events. The sun was fully up by the time they reached the ranch, where they found Sarah efficiently managing the morning routine while keeping the younger children entertained with stories about their parents' heroic rescue mission. "Are the hurt men going to be all right?" Emma asked anxiously, as Margaret gathered her into a welcoming hug. "They're going to be fine, sweetheart. Dr. Blackwood is an excellent doctor, and they're very lucky men." "Did you help save them, Mama Margaret?" Rebecca wanted to know. "I helped Dr. Blackwood, which means I helped a little bit, but the real heroes were the men who went into the dangerous mine to bring them out." Thomas caught her eye over the children's heads, his expression warm with pride and admiration. That evening, after the children were finally settled and they had collapsed into their own bed, he brought up Dr. Blackwood's suggestion. "She's right, you know. You do have a gift for medical work. I watched you tonight, saw how calm and competent. You were in a situation that would have overwhelmed most people." "It was just one night," Margaret protested, "and I was following Dr. Blackwood's instructions. It was more than that, and you know it. The question is, would you want to pursue it? Dr. Blackwood could probably arrange for you to study with her, learn more advanced techniques." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the possibility. "What about the children, this family? I won't do anything that takes me away from what matters most." The children are growing up, Margaret. Sarah's 14 and more capable every day. The twins are becoming independent. In a few years, they'll need less day-to-day care and more guidance toward their own futures. Having additional skills, another way to contribute to the community, that would be good for all of us. The conversation marked another turning point in Margaret's journey from mail-order bride to integral member of both her family and her community. She had come to Cedar Ridge seeking refuge from a life that no longer fit her. Now she was discovering possibilities she had never imagined, ways to build a future that honored both her limitations and her strengths. As she drifted off to sleep in Thomas's arms, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their sleeping children, and the vast Wyoming night beyond their windows, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The secret that had driven her from Boston had nearly destroyed her chance for happiness, but revealing it had ultimately freed her to become the person she was meant to be. She was no longer defined by what she couldn't do or give. Instead, she was valued for who she was and what she could contribute. As a wife, a mother, a healer, and a woman who had found her place in a world that welcomed her exactly as she was. 2 years had passed since that pivotal night at the Morrison mine, and the changes in both Margaret and the Garrett family were remarkable. What had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers had evolved into something beautiful and enduring, a true partnership built on love, respect, and shared purpose. Margaret had indeed pursued medical training under Dr. Blackwood's guidance, studying anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical techniques with an intensity that surprised even herself. 3 afternoons a week, she rode into town to assist at the doctor's clinic, learning to suture wounds, set broken bones, and deliver babies. Her natural aptitude for healing work, combined with her teaching background's emphasis on patience and clear communication, made her an invaluable assistant. The arrangement worked perfectly for the family. Sarah, now 16 and remarkably mature, had stepped naturally into managing the household during Margaret's absences. The girl had also begun her own teaching career, working with Mrs. Cooper at the Cedar Ridge School and showing exceptional skill with the younger students. "I think Sarah has surpassed both of us in classroom management," Margaret confided to Thomas one evening as they watched their eldest daughter helping Rebecca and Emma with their arithmetic lessons. "She has that perfect combination of firmness and kindness that makes children want to learn." "She learned from the best," Thomas replied, his arm tightening around Margaret's waist. "Watching you with all of them these past 3 years has taught her what real mothering looks like." The twins, now 12, had channeled their boundless energy into constructive projects around the ranch. Under Thomas's guidance, they had become skilled at carpentry, metalwork, and mechanical repairs. Their latest triumph was a windmill they had designed and built themselves, which now provided consistent water for the vegetable garden and livestock. Rebecca, at 10, had developed into a true artist. Her detailed drawings and paintings of ranch life had caught the attention of visitors from Denver, and one wealthy banker had actually commissioned her to create a series of paintings depicting frontier family life. The money from these sales was being carefully saved for Rebecca's future education. Emma, now 7, had not only found her voice, but had become the family storyteller. Her imagination was vivid and her memory remarkable, and she entertained the family with elaborate tales about the animals on the ranch, the mountains surrounding them, and the adventures she planned to have when she grew up. Baby James, no longer a baby at 3.5, was everyone's delight. He followed Thomas around the ranch like a devoted puppy, imitating his every gesture and announcing to anyone who would listen that he was going to be a wancher just like his papa when he grew up. The family had faced challenges, of course. The winter of 1891 had been particularly harsh, with blizzards that isolated them for weeks at a time and temperatures that killed half their livestock. But they had weathered the crisis together, and Margaret had discovered that hardship shared with people you loved was far more bearable than comfort experienced alone. There had been moments of loss as well. Mrs. Adelaide Crowley, the kind boarding house owner who had first shown Margaret Thomas's advertisement, had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous spring. Margaret had travelled back to Boston for the funeral, her first return to the city since leaving nearly 4 years earlier. The trip had been a revelation. Walking through the familiar streets of Beacon Hill, visiting the school where she had taught, even calling on her parents' Beacon Hill mansion, Margaret had felt like a stranger observing someone else's life. The rigid social conventions, the suffocating propriety, the narrow expectations for women, all of it seemed impossibly constraining after the freedom and purpose she had found in Wyoming. Her parents had received her politely but coolly, clearly, disapproving of her frontier life and rustic appearance. Her mother had made pointed comments about Margaret's sun-weathered hands and practical clothing, while her father had questioned the wisdom of living among savages and criminals so far from civilization. You could still come home, her mother had said during their final visit. Charles Pemberton married last year, but there are other suitable men. Your father could arrange something appropriate. Margaret had looked at this woman who had given her life, but had never truly understood her, feeling pity rather than anger. Mother, I am home. I've been home for nearly 4 years now. I have a husband who loves and respects me, 6 children who need me, and work that gives my life meaning. I have everything I could possibly want. The conversation had ended there, and Margaret had left Boston knowing she would probably never return. The city that had once represented everything proper and desirable now felt like a beautiful prison, elegant but lifeless. Returning to Cedar Ridge had felt like breathing again. Thomas had met her at the train station, and the moment she saw his face, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The children had overwhelmed her with hugs and chatter about everything that had happened during her absence, and that evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing stories and laughter, Margaret had felt the deep contentment that came from being part of something larger than herself. How was Boston? Thomas had asked later that night as they prepared for bed. Small, Margaret had replied simply. Much smaller than I remembered. Now, 2 years later, that trip felt like a distant memory. Margaret's life was full in ways she had never imagined possible. Her medical work had expanded beyond assisting Dr. Blackwood. She now made house calls to isolated ranches, delivered babies when the doctor was unavailable, and had even performed emergency surgery on occasion. The territorial government had recently passed legislation allowing women to practice medicine with appropriate training and examination. Margaret was one of the first women in Wyoming to take advantage of this opportunity, and after studying intensively and passing a rigorous examination in Cheyenne, she had received official certification as a medical practitioner. Dr. Margaret Garrett, Thomas had said proudly when the certificate arrived, testing out how the title sounded. I like the ring of that. I'm not really a doctor, Margaret had protested. I don't have a medical degree from a university. You have something better, Thomas had replied. You have knowledge gained through experience, compassion earned through suffering, and skills proven in real emergencies. The people of this territory trust you with their lives and the lives of their children. If that doesn't make you a doctor, I don't know what does. The recognition had opened new doors for Margaret. She had been invited to speak at medical conferences in Denver and Cheyenne, sharing her experiences with frontier medicine and advocating for better medical training opportunities for women. She had also begun writing articles for medical journals, documenting innovative treatments and techniques developed out of necessity in remote locations. But despite these professional achievements, Margaret's greatest joy remained her family. watching the children grow and thrive, seeing them develop their individual talents and personalities, sharing in their triumphs and comforting them through their difficulties. These were the moments that gave her life its deepest meaning. This particular evening in late spring of 1892, the family was gathered on the front porch, as had become their custom, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, mending one of James's shirts, while keeping one eye on the boy as he played with wooden blocks in the corner. Sarah was reading aloud from a letter she had received from the teacher training college in Denver, where she planned to continue her education the following year. Rebecca was sketching the sunset, her artist's eye capturing the subtle changes in light and color as evening approached. The twins were quietly playing chess, a game Thomas had taught them as a way to channel their competitive energy into strategic thinking. Emma sat at Margaret's feet, weaving wildflowers into chains while narrating an elaborate story about a princess who lived in the mountains and could talk to animals. Her imagination had only grown more vivid with age, and Margaret suspected the child might have a future as a writer if she chose to pursue it. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, settling into the chair beside her, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" she asked, not looking up from her mending. "It's been 4 years since you answered my advertisement. 4 years since you took a chance on a stranger and 6 children you'd never met. I was wondering, do you ever regret it? Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you'd made different choices?" Margaret set down her sewing and looked at him with surprise. "Regret it? Thomas, these have been the best 4 years of my life. How could I possibly regret finding my family, my home, my purpose? Even knowing all the hardships we've faced, the isolation, the harsh winters, the financial struggles, the medical emergencies, especially knowing all of that," Margaret replied firmly. "In Boston I lived a comfortable life, but it was empty. I was going through the motions of existing without ever really living. Here, every day matters. Every challenge we overcome makes us stronger. Every joy we share is more precious because we've earned it together." Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I love you, Margaret Garrett, not just for what you've given to me and the children, but for who you are, for your strength, your kindness, your determination to make a difference in the world." "I love you too," Margaret replied, her heart swelling, with the familiar warmth that came whenever Thomas spoke to her this way. "All of you, this whole beautiful, chaotic, wonderful family." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma, who had apparently been listening despite her apparent absorption in flower weaving. "Mama Margaret," she said seriously, "are you and Papa going to have more babies?" The question that once would have devastated Margaret now brought only a gentle smile. "No, sweetheart, we have exactly the right number of children already. 6 is perfect for this family." "Good," Emma declared matter-of-factly, "because if you had more babies, there might not be enough room for everyone at the dinner table, and James might have to eat outside with the chickens." The adults laughed at this practical assessment, and James looked up from his blocks with indignation. "I not eat with chickens. Chickens smell funny." As the evening shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Cedar Ridge as a desperate woman, fleeing a life that no longer fit, carrying a secret that felt like a poison in her veins. She had been prepared to settle for a marriage of convenience, grateful for any acceptance she could find. Instead, she had discovered love in its truest form. Not the romantic fantasy she had dreamed of as a young woman, but something deeper and more enduring, love that was built on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and the daily choice to care for each other through whatever challenges life might bring. She had found her purpose not in bearing children, but in raising them, not in conforming to society's expectations, but in creating her own definition of what it meant to be a woman, a wife, and a mother. She had discovered that healing others could heal her own wounded spirit, and that the frontier offered opportunities for growth and achievement that the settled East could never provide. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the thing that seems like your greatest weakness can become your greatest strength. Her inability to bear children had driven her from Boston in shame, but it had also freed her to love the 6 children who needed her without reservation. She could pour all her maternal instincts into Sarah, Michael, Matthew, Rebecca, Emma, and James without holding anything back for future babies who would never come. "Time for bed, everyone," Sarah announced, taking charge as she so often did. "School tomorrow and Mama Margaret has to be at the clinic early." The evening ritual of getting 6 children ready for bed was as chaotic as ever, but Margaret had long since learned to find joy in the chaos. There were teeth to be brushed, prayers to be said, stories to be told, and disputes to be settled. There were goodnight hugs and whispered confidences, and the inevitable requests for just one more of everything. Finally, the house was quiet, except for the gentle sounds of sleeping children and the night wind sighing through the pines. Margaret and Thomas made their way to their own bedroom, tired but content after another full day of ranch and family life. "You know," Margaret said as she brushed her hair at the small mirror on their dresser, "Dr. Blackwood mentioned that the Territorial Medical Board is looking for someone to establish a medical training program for women. They want someone with practical experience who can teach both textbook medicine and frontier adaptations." Thomas paused in hanging up his shirt, immediately understanding the implications. "Are you interested?" "I think I might be. It would mean travel, organizing curricula, examining candidates, but it would also mean training more women to provide medical care in isolated areas. Think how many lives could be saved if every settlement had someone with real medical training." "It sounds like exactly the kind of challenge you'd excel at," Thomas said warmly, "and it would build on everything you've learned these past few years." Margaret smiled at his immediate support for her ambitions. This was what their marriage had become, a true partnership where each person's dreams and goals were valued and supported by the other. As they settled into bed, Margaret nestled against Thomas's side, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the peaceful sounds of their sleeping children down the hall. 4 years ago, she had been a broken woman, fleeing a life that had rejected her. Tonight, she was Dr. Margaret Garrett, wife, mother, healer, and pioneer in her own right. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Cedar Ridge carrying a devastating secret had found something she had never dared to hope for. A place where she was valued not despite her limitations, but because of her strengths. She had discovered that family was not defined by blood or biology, but by love, commitment, and the daily choice to care for each other. And as she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had seen her true worth from the very beginning, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The answer to Thomas's prayers had indeed been answered, but perhaps the greater miracle was that Margaret had found the answer to her own prayers as well. 5 years had passed since Margaret first stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge, and the anniversary had become a celebration in the Garrett household. What had begun as a day of nervous anticipation and uncertainty was now marked as Arrival Day, the moment their family truly began. The ranch had prospered under Thomas and Margaret's joint leadership. Margaret's medical practice had brought in additional income, while Thomas's innovative ranching techniques had increased their cattle yields significantly. They had purchased adjacent land from a retiring neighbor, expanding their operation and their influence in the territory. More importantly, they had become pillars of the Cedar Ridge community. Margaret's medical expertise was sought throughout the territory, and she had recently been appointed to the Wyoming Territorial Medical Board, the first woman to hold such a position. Thomas served on the town council and had been instrumental in bringing the railroad spur that now connected Cedar Ridge directly to the Denver line. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the children themselves. Sarah, now 18, had completed her teacher training and accepted a position as headmistress of the new Cedar Ridge Academy. Her dream of education had expanded beyond simple teaching. She envisioned a school that would prepare frontier children for whatever future they chose, whether that meant managing ranches, pursuing professional careers, or attending universities. In the East, I want to prove that geographical isolation doesn't mean intellectual limitation, Sarah explained to Margaret as they walked through the construction site of the new school building. These children are just as capable as any student in Boston or New York. They simply need the opportunity to develop their potential. Margaret watched her eldest daughter with profound pride. Sarah had grown into a remarkable young woman, intelligent, compassionate, and driven by a desire to improve the world around her. Several young men in the territory had expressed interest in courting her, but Sarah was focused on establishing her career first. "There will be time for marriage and family later," she told Margaret practically. "Right now, education is my passion, and I want to see how far I can take it." The twins, now 14, had developed distinct personalities despite their identical appearance. Michael had inherited Thomas's mechanical aptitude and spent his free time designing improvements for ranch equipment. His latest project was a new type of cattle gate that could be operated from horseback, eliminating the need for cowboys to dismount repeatedly during roundups. Matthew, meanwhile, had discovered a love of geology and spent hours exploring the mountains around their ranch, collecting mineral samples and studying rock formations. He had already identified 2 previously unknown mineral deposits on their property, and a mining engineer from Denver had offered to partner with the family to develop one of the sites. "Matthew might make us rich," Thomas joked one evening as his son excitedly described his latest geological discovery. Between his rocks and Michael's inventions, these boys are going to revolutionize frontier life. Rebecca, at 12, had indeed become the artist Margaret had recognized in her years earlier. Her paintings were now sold in galleries in Denver and Colorado Springs, and she had received a scholarship offer from an art academy in San Francisco. The decision about whether to accept would need to be made soon, and Margaret could see the internal struggle Rebecca faced between her artistic ambitions and her love for the ranch. "I don't want to leave the family," Rebecca confided to Margaret one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. "But Mrs. Harrison says this opportunity might not come again. She says I have real talent that could take me anywhere in the world." "What does your heart tell you?" Margaret asked gently. "That I want both things. I want to study art and learn from great masters, but I also want to stay here where I belong. Is it foolish to love this place so much that leaving feels impossible?" Margaret paused in her weeding, considering her response carefully. "Rebecca, there's no shame in loving home, but there's also no shame in wanting to grow beyond it. Perhaps the question isn't whether to leave, but whether you trust that home will still be here when you're ready to return." Emma, now 9, had indeed become the family storyteller, but her talents had expanded beyond simple imagination. She'd begun writing down her stories and had recently submitted one to a children's magazine in Chicago. The editor had not only accepted it for publication, but had requested more stories from this remarkable young voice from the frontier. The publication had caused quite a stir in Cedar Ridge. Emma was the youngest person in the territory to be published in a national magazine, and her success had inspired other children to try their hand at writing. Margaret had started a writing circle for young people, meeting once a week to share stories and provide encouragement. "I want to write books that help people understand what life is really like out here," Emma told Margaret seriously. "Most of the stories people read about the frontier are written by men who think it's all about gunfights and cattle rustling. I want to write about families and communities and the real adventures that happen every day." James, now 5, and half, remained everyone's darling. His bright curiosity and infectious laughter kept the family entertained, and his complete lack of fear often terrified the adults who were responsible for keeping him safe. He had recently learned to read and was working his way through every book in the house with determination that impressed his teacher. "James is going to be trouble when he gets older," Thomas observed one evening after rescuing his youngest son from yet another dangerous climbing adventure. "He has no sense of limitations and enough charm to talk his way out of any consequence." "He reminds me of someone," Margaret replied with a meaningful look. "A certain rancher who decided to take on 6 orphan children without knowing the first thing about raising them. The success of their family had not gone unnoticed in the broader community. Margaret regularly received letters from women across the territory asking for advice about everything from medical concerns to family management. The story of the mail-order bride who had transformed a grieving household into a thriving family had become something of a legend. These letters had inspired Margaret's latest project, a comprehensive guide for frontier women that covered everything from basic medical care to child-rearing, household management, and even legal rights. She was collaborating with Dr. Blackwood and several other prominent women to create a resource that would be practical, accurate, and encouraging. "Too many women come west feeling unprepared and isolated," Margaret explained to Thomas as she worked on the manuscript one evening. "If we can provide them with reliable information and reassurance that they're not alone in their struggles, we might prevent some of the tragedies I've seen over the years." The book project had led to something even more significant: an invitation to speak at the National Women's Conference in Chicago. The organizers wanted Margaret to address the topic of women's opportunities in the American West, and the invitation represented recognition of her unique perspective as both a medical professional and a pioneer wife and mother. "I never imagined when I stepped off that train 5 years ago that I would someday be considered an expert on anything," Margaret mused as she prepared her speech. "I was just a frightened woman running from a life that no longer fit." "You were never just anything," Thomas replied firmly. "You were always someone special. You simply needed the right circumstances to show it." The trip to Chicago would be Margaret's first major journey away from the family since her return to Boston years earlier. The children were excited about the honor, but anxious about her absence, and elaborate plans were being made to ensure the household ran smoothly during her 2-week trip. "Sarah will manage the daily routines," Margaret explained during a family meeting. "Thomas will handle any emergencies, and Dr. Blackwood has agreed to take over my medical responsibilities while I'm gone." "What if someone has a baby while you're away?" Emma asked with practical concern. "Then Dr. Blackwood will deliver it, just like she did before I learned to help. And if there's any really serious emergency, Sarah knows how to send a telegram." To Chicago, the preparations for the trip had become a family affair. Rebecca was designing a special dress for Margaret to wear during her speech, using fabric purchased from Denver and incorporating a pattern inspired by the wildflowers that grew around their ranch. Sarah was helping organize Margaret's notes and research materials. The twins were constructing a special trunk with multiple compartments for carrying documents and personal items. Even James was contributing to the effort, creating a small drawing of the ranch that Margaret could show to people who asked about their home. His artistic skills were rudimentary, but his representation of the house, barn, and family was recognizable and touching. The night before Margaret's departure, the family gathered for a special dinner featuring everyone's favorite dishes. Conversation was lively and affectionate, with much teasing about Margaret's upcoming fame and many expressions of pride in her achievements. "I want everyone to remember," Margaret said, as the evening wound down, "that whatever recognition I receive in Chicago belongs to all of us. Everything I've accomplished has been possible because of this family's love and support. And we want you to remember," Thomas replied, "that you've given us far more than we ever gave you. You saved this family, Margaret. You turned 6 scared, grieving children and 1 overwhelmed man into something beautiful and strong." As Margaret tucked each child into bed that night, she reflected on how dramatically their relationships had evolved. Sarah had become not just a daughter, but a trusted confidant and partner in managing the family. The twins had grown from mischievous boys into young men with clear goals and impressive capabilities. Rebecca was blossoming into an artist of real talent. Emma was developing into a storyteller who could capture hearts with her words, and James remained the sunshine that brightened every day. Her relationship with Thomas had deepened beyond anything she had imagined possible when she first entered his advertisement. They had become true partners in every sense, professionally, domestically, and emotionally. The practical arrangement between strangers had evolved into a love story that was all the more powerful for being built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As she finally settled into bed beside Thomas, Margaret thought about the speech she would give in Chicago. She planned to talk about the opportunities the West offered to women willing to step beyond traditional boundaries. But she also wanted to address the challenges and the importance of community support. "The frontier doesn't automatically liberate women," she had written in her notes, "but it does provide space for those brave enough to define their own roles and create their own opportunities. Success requires not just individual courage, but the support of family and community." Tomorrow, she would board the train that would carry her to Chicago and national recognition. But tonight, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of her sleeping family and the vast Wyoming night beyond their windows, Margaret knew that her greatest achievement would always be this: the love she had found, the children she had raised, and the life she had built in the place she would always call home. The mail-order bride, who had once carried a secret that threatened to destroy her future, was now carrying a message of hope and possibility to women across the nation. It was a journey that had begun with desperation and was culminating in triumph, but the destination that mattered most was always the same: the ranch in Cedar Ridge, where her family waited and where her heart would always belong. Margaret stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of Chicago's Palmer House Hotel, looking out at an audience of nearly 300 women. The sea of faces before her represented educators, physicians, reformers, and pioneers from across the nation, women who had gathered to discuss the changing role of women in American society. Just 6 years earlier, she had been a broken woman fleeing Boston in shame, convinced that her inability to bear children made her worthless. Now she was addressing the National Women's Conference as a recognized expert on frontier medicine and women's opportunities in the developing West. "Ladies," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ornate ballroom, "when I stepped off a train in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming 6 years ago, I believed I was going to the end of the world. I thought I was settling for a life of limitation and isolation. Instead, I discovered that the frontier offers something precious to women willing to embrace it, the chance to define ourselves by what we can do rather than what we cannot." The audience listened with rapt attention as Margaret shared her story. She spoke honestly about her medical condition, the social exile it had caused in Boston, and her desperate decision to become a mail-order bride. But she focused primarily on what had followed: the discovery of her gifts as a healer, her role in raising 6 children who weren't biologically hers, and her evolution into a medical professional serving an entire territory. "The West didn't change who I was," Margaret continued. "It simply provided space for me to become who I was meant to be. In established Eastern society, a woman like me, barren, unmarried, considered damaged goods, had no place. But on the frontier, usefulness matters more than conformity. Skills matter more than scandal. Contribution matters more than convention." She talked about the challenges frontier women faced: isolation, harsh conditions, limited resources, and the constant threat of medical emergencies with inadequate care. But she also described the opportunities: the chance to work alongside their husbands as true partners, to develop professional skills out of necessity, and to build communities where women's contributions were valued and respected. In Wyoming territory, women have had the right to vote for over 20 years, Margaret noted, drawing murmurs of admiration from the audience. "We serve on juries, own property in our own names, and practice professions that remain closed to women in many Eastern states. This isn't because Western men are more enlightened. It's because frontier life requires the full participation of everyone to survive and thrive." Margaret's speech was interrupted several times by spontaneous applause, particularly when she discussed her work training other women in medical techniques and her advocacy for women's professional education. When she finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. During the question period that followed, Margaret was asked about everything from specific medical procedures to advice for women considering moving west. One question touched her particularly deeply. "Mrs. Garrett," asked a young woman near the front, "you've spoken about finding purpose in raising children who weren't born to you. Do you have advice for women who cannot bear children but still dream of motherhood?" Margaret paused, remembering her own anguish when Dr. Whitmore had first delivered his devastating diagnosis. "I would tell such women that motherhood is not defined by pregnancy and childbirth. It's defined by love, commitment, and the daily choice to nurture young lives. There are countless children in this world who need mothers, through adoption, through marriage to widowed fathers, through teaching and mentoring. Biology is just one path to motherhood, not the only path." The response drew another round of applause, and Margaret saw tears in several women's eyes. After the formal session ended, she was surrounded by women wanting to share their own stories and seek personal advice. One conversation particularly moved her. A young teacher from Kansas approached hesitantly, explaining that she had been considering a position in a remote Colorado mining town, but was afraid to venture so far from family and civilization. "I've been offered a salary 3 times what I earn here," the woman explained, "and the chance to establish an entire school system from scratch. But I'm terrified of the isolation and responsibility." "Fear is natural," Margaret replied gently. "I was terrified when I boarded that train to Wyoming. But sometimes the things that frighten us most are the very experiences that reveal our true capabilities. If the opportunity calls to your heart, don't let fear be the only voice you listen to." The conference lasted 3 days, during which Margaret attended sessions on women's suffrage, educational reform, and professional opportunities. She met remarkable women from across the country: doctors, lawyers, teachers, and reformers who were quietly revolutionizing American society through their courage and determination. But as inspiring as the conference was, Margaret found herself increasingly homesick. The grandeur of Chicago, the sophistication of the hotel, the stimulating intellectual conversations, none of it could compare to the simple pleasure of sitting on her ranch porch with Thomas and the children, watching the sun set behind the mountains. On her final evening in Chicago, Margaret received a telegram that brought tears to her eyes. "Mama Margaret, stop. Rebecca won first prize at Territorial Art Exhibition. Stop, Emma published another story. Stop, James lost 2 teeth. Stop, missing you terribly. Stop, all our love. Stop, Thomas and children." The message crystallized everything Margaret had learned during her journey. Professional recognition was gratifying, public speaking was fulfilling, and contributing to the national conversation about women's roles was important. But her greatest achievement would always be the family she had helped create and nurture. The train journey back to Wyoming felt endless, though Margaret spent the time productively writing notes for her Frontier Women's Guidebook and planning improvements to the medical training program she was developing. But when the familiar peaks surrounding Cedar Ridge finally came into view, her heart leapt with genuine joy. Thomas was waiting at the station, as he had been 6 years earlier, though this time he was accompanied by all 6 children. The reunion was chaotic and joyful, with everyone talking at once about Margaret's trip and everything that had happened during her absence. "How was it being famous?" Emma asked, as they rode home in the expanded wagon Thomas had purchased to accommodate their larger family. "Interesting," Margaret replied honestly, "but not nearly as wonderful as being home." That evening, the family gathered for a celebration dinner featuring all of Margaret's favorite dishes. As they shared stories about the conference and court up on Ranch News, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. She had gone to Chicago as Mrs. Margaret Garrett, respected medical professional and frontier advocate. But she was returning as something even more precious, the heart of a family that had chosen each other and committed to building something beautiful together. "Tell us about your speech," Sarah requested. "Did you really address 300 women?" Margaret described the conference, the audience, and the conversations that had followed. But as she talked about the women she had met and the stories they had shared, she realized something profound. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I spent 3 days talking to remarkable women who are changing the world in important ways. But I came home remembering that the most revolutionary thing any of us can do is love each other well and raise the next generation to be better than we are." Thomas reached for her hand across the table, his eyes warm with understanding. "That sounds like something a very wise woman would say." As the evening wound down and the children prepared for bed, Margaret walked through the house that had become her sanctuary. She paused in each child's room, listening to their prayers and tucking them in with the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. In Sarah's room, she found her eldest daughter reading by lamplight, preparing for the next day's classes at the academy. "Margaret," Sarah said quietly, "thank you for showing me that a woman can be anything she chooses to be. Watching you these past 6 years has taught me that limitations exist only in our minds." In the twins' room, she found Michael and Matthew discussing plans for a new irrigation system they wanted to build during the summer break. Their enthusiasm for improving the ranch reminded Margaret that home was not just a place, but a living project that required constant care and innovation. Rebecca showed her 3 new paintings completed during Margaret's absence, each one demonstrating growing sophistication and emotional depth. Emma had filled an entire notebook with story ideas, inspired by Margaret's descriptions of Chicago. Even James had a surprise. He had learned to write his name in careful, crooked letters. Finally, Margaret joined Thomas on their bedroom balcony, looking out over the ranch they had built together and the valley that stretched toward the mountains. The night was clear and still, filled with the familiar sounds of cattle, wind, and the distant call of an owl. "Any regrets about giving up your chance at national fame?" Thomas asked with gentle teasing. None whatsoever, Margaret replied firmly. Chicago was wonderful, but this is where I belong. This is where my heart lives. As they prepared for bed, Margaret thought about the young woman who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge 6 years earlier, carrying a secret that had felt like a death sentence. That woman could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love, the purpose, the recognition, and most importantly, the deep sense of belonging that came from being valued exactly as she was. The mail-order bride who had believed herself to be damaged. Goods had discovered that her perceived weakness was actually her strength. Her inability to bear children had freed her to love without reservation, to heal without limitation, and to build a family based on choice rather than biology. Now, as she drifted off to sleep in Thomas's arms, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their sleeping children and the vast Wyoming night beyond their windows, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. She was Dr. Margaret Garrett, wife, mother, healer, and pioneer, a woman who had discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the deepest disappointments. Her journey from Boston to Wyoming had been more than a geographical relocation. It had been a transformation from a woman defined by her limitations to one celebrated for her contributions. And the greatest gift of all was the knowledge that the best chapter of her story was not her recognition in Chicago, but the quiet daily miracle of the family that called her home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.